This next section is on risk management business continuity. You should have two handouts that you've received from Gabriel, one that's kind of a worksheet, and then one that looks more like a problem where you have to come up with some answers. We will work through the worksheet together, and then I'll ask you to take the other one and come up with some, taking it a little further sorts of things. The whole purpose of this block is to touch on risk and how do we assess risk? How do we make decisions around risk? And ultimately, the reason why organizations care about risk is because their business has to continue going. Business continuity is a big thing, right? If my business cannot continue, we no longer make money, people lose jobs, there's actually no reason to do security things anymore because the business does not exist. So we'll touch a little bit on what that is. You could take an entire course on risk management. We're going to cover some high points here in about an hour. All right, so when we go back to the whole idea of threats, risk, and so forth, we're going to look at risk as being the threat or the likelihood of something happening times the vulnerability, which is really what is that exploited thing that happens? What does that cost? So there is a balance between the utility and the cost of various risk management options, right? So let me give you some extreme examples. If I told you, if you invest $10, you're guaranteed to avoid losing $100. How many of you say I'm spending that $10? Probably all of us, right? We get to another point though. What if I told you, if you spend $100, you can guarantee yourself not to lose $10? How many of you are saying that's a good idea? Right? Exactly. Please give me $100. You can get 10. Most of us are not making that investment. You're like, yeah, maybe I'm okay losing that $10 for that risk. Very extreme examples. We're going to go through a process of actually uncovering what is the actual payoff. What are we saving by investing in various mitigation techniques when it comes to reducing risk in our organization? Because at the end of the day, right, who decides how money gets spent in an organization? Does the director of security get to decide how much money is spent on security? No. What does the director of security have to do to get a budget? Beg who? Maybe the director of finance. I like to say the C-suite, right? You go to the C-suite, you say, I need $1 million to do these things. Well, most C-suites are run by finance people, right? Finance people, we've got to make sure we've got the best shareholder return, all these various different things. If you say, I need to spend money, they're going to want to say, why? If I'm buying a new machine that's going to create widgets, and I can tell you that, we'll spend $1 million on this machine for the amount of widgets it allows us to create. Within a year and a half, the machine is paid for, and then everything's gravy profit after that. They say, okay, a year and a half return on investment for this machine that you want to buy, that makes sense. They can do that kind of math. When it comes to security, are we creating widgets? What are we promising? We're promising you are not going to lose money. So if I'm successful and I don't lose money, how can I prove that I would have lost money if we hadn't have done that thing? A bit of a problem, right? Yeah.
Catch-22. I remember I talked to some people in the industry, and absolutely, you're correct. You have to go to the C-suite. So typically, if you translate the security threat that you imagine in your head, dollars and cents, you're speaking that language.
Exactly. And that's exactly what we're going to be doing. Is we're going to try to take what it is we are going to do and use some math to demonstrate the dollars and the cents. But it's more difficult, to sell the corporate suite. It's getting easier, right? The corporate suite is finally starting to take security a lot more seriously than they were, but it's still a challenge to convince them that investing money in something to make sure that something we don't know would even happen, but could happen, won't happen, can be a tough sell. So we need to have a process, some level of of math to be able to do those sorts of things. So you all should have a worksheet that says Jones and Bartlett learning on the top of it. Mine's in color because it's got the answers on it. But I want to walk through this worksheet together. And I'm going to come back over here and we'll do math as we need to on this form. So, all right. So we've got a couple of terms on here that we'll define and talk about. The first of which is the SLE, right? Which is a single loss expectancy, which is a total loss expected from a single incident. So let's assume for a minute, and I think this actually lines up with our exercise. Let's assume I lose my iPhone. It's been issued to me by my organization. They gave me an iPhone. If I lose one, what's the cost of that? Yeah.
Approximately $1,200.
Maybe $1,200. We're going to use nice round numbers in these exercises because it makes math easier. And I think we're going to say it's $500, but we call it $1,000. There is some value to me losing a single device, right? That's what a single loss expectancy is. If I lose that device, how much does it cost? Again, with an iPhone, we could get an absolute number for that number, right? We know what it costs if an iPhone is lost. What if my network is hacked a single time? Is there a value to that? Do I know just, someone hacked into WSC's network? What's that single loss expectancy for that one time the network was hacked into? It will vary, right? But we're trying to know in advance, so we have to put a number on it.
Yeah, that's a full system audit of every information system that could possibly be there.
That's what we have to do after the fact, perhaps.
So
But we want to know ahead of the fact. Right, we might do some work to find out how people have to fix it. That might be one way to estimate those numbers. Yeah.
If we take an average over past instances, or we use proxy data from other organizations that have experienced such issues.
Exactly. That's how I would probably do it for estimating purposes, right? We are at a point now where there are data repositories where people share information and we can get a rough idea of about what it would cost. It's not going to be precise, but we want to use as good of an estimate as we can without spending a whole year doing an audit to figure out these things. We might actually learn stuff we probably didn't want to know, or maybe we did want to know, but causing other issues. So we're going to, at some level, come up with that single loss expectancy. So we're going to have that number. We're also going to have our ARO, which is the annual rate of occurrence. So when it comes to my phone, how many, an organization of 1,000 employees, how many people are going to break, lose, damage, destroy their phone in a year? I don't know. Last year it happened 12 times. Well, let's use last year's numbers to use a justification for what we're going to do. How many times do we expect our network's going to be hacked? Historical data is a good place to get this number. There's also trends that are happening in industry, other sorts of things. We can come up with estimates of what is that annual rate of occurrence. How often is that going to happen? And then the last number that we're going to have is the ALE, which is the annual loss expectancy. And so to get that number, all I'm going to do is I'm going to take the value of this iPhone, right, and multiply it by the number of times I think it's going to be lost. So if it's worth $1,000 and we expect 10 of them in our organization get lost, destroyed, whatever, then that cost me $10,000. So that's how much of a risk we're facing as an organization. So if you look at your worksheet, we have scenario 1 described out about Richmond Investments, right? And they provide smartphones to their employees. We're valuing this smartphone at $500. Approximately 1,000 employees have them. And in the past year, 75 have been lost or damaged. So let's put numbers to those 3 fields. So what's the single loss expectancy from that scenario? Yeah.
$500.
$500. Not 5,000. 500. All right. How many? What's the ARO? Shout at me.
75.
75. And when I multiply that together, if you can do math, what do I get for 37,500? So we are losing annually because we give everybody iPhones or smartphones, right? They must not be iPhones, they're only $500 in Android. We're losing $37,500. Okay, great. Now we've got opportunities to potentially do something about that, right? Someone's pitching a product to us to deal with these sorts of things. So if we continue on that worksheet, Richmond is thinking about buying insurance. Not a bad idea, right? So they can potentially not lose some of that money. We're going to use that annual loss expectancy number to determine the usefulness of this safeguard. So this insurance they could purchase would be for each device, they'd pay $25 per year. The safeguard value then is $25 times that $1,000. So they could spend $25,000 on insurance. And if it's purchased, then that ARO that we had was estimated to change to 5 from 75. We have to determine, is it worth spending that $25,000 on this insurance to come out ahead? So the current ALE is what? We've already calculated this. 37,500. Okay. And then with the new control in place, the ARO with control is what? If we buy that insurance, the ARO becomes 5. And so the ALE then with that control is what? One, how much? So if we lost 5 devices at $500, isn't that 2,500? Is that what you said? Yeah, we'll get there. But right now, with the control, what we're going to potentially lose is 2,500 instead of 37,500. And so we're going to ask ourselves, are we going to spend $25,000 to recognize those savings and losses? So the savings with the control, if I take the current ALE, the next line, the savings with control, if I take that, the current ALE minus that 2,500, then I am saving $35,000. But in order to save that number, I have to spend $25,000, which means I would realize savings of $10,000. So because this number is positive, we could make the argument that it is worth spending $25,000 to save $35,000. We come out $10,000 ahead. Yeah. Right. If I was losing 75.
Decrease to 5, not decrease by 5.
Correct. Oh yeah. Oh, hopefully that's written right. But that's what the intent was how this is. So yeah, if it was only by 5, the math changes. Then all of a sudden we're not doing it. So yeah, if we may change this number to 70 instead of to 5, then all of a sudden the math doesn't come out with this number being positive. If this number becomes negative, then we're losing money by making that investment, buying that insurance, and we should not buy it. That makes sense? Ever kind of follow that process? All right, so we're going to skip the qualitative. I'll come back to that in a minute. What I would like you all to do is there is a second worksheet that you have in front of you. I didn't get one from Gabriel because I didn't bring one for myself. Yes, a single page worksheet that describes a number of different scenarios. What I want you guys to do, and you can work with your partners, I don't care, this is an individual thing, is go through, do the math, figure out each of those scenarios, how do these numbers turn out? And then at the bottom, I give you 3 budgetary numbers. Based on each of those scenarios, I want you to tell me what you're going to do. You can invest in more than one of the options if you have enough money to do so. So you'll notice I give you increasing amount of money with these things, and your decision should change as you have more money to invest. So go ahead and go through that process. I'll wander around and answer questions. But this is ultimately what organizations would do as they're trying to decide how do they invest in different security solutions.
So that's how we single loss expectancy expected cost.
And people that are online, you should find these worksheets out on the CySER website. I have had that.
Insurance. It would decrease the
Savings minus.
We don't necessarily play very well.
I got 10,000 for both. Like that.
Area 3 might be very good.
Realize savings is
Yeah.
So is this,
So
it's making obvious now.
So they're very much better.
That's not a good way. No, that was just why it's like, that's what people decided if you're left.
So the website. There are. Or 3 would probably just get So the price for $4,000, and that will cause a new especially they're
Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah.
The different parts, extra budgets for all the different.
Correct. So you have $10,000. What do you do?
Yeah.
That's good. Because
Yeah.
So, for these, do you have a $10,000 budget and all these scenarios exist, so you're
Correct.
never maybe by this one, not this one?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep.
And then who's doing this insurance? How are, is it like, you have insurance and like, I break my phone once and then that's covered the February weekend?
So the way I like to think of it is basically there's a deductible that once you're paid for 5, then insurance will cover the rest.
Okay.
So what the organization would recognize is they would only have to pay for 5, and any other losses.
So it's like a health insurance. Like when I insure my glasses, they're like, you get one broker pair of glasses.
So that's an individual, right? So an organization, they would basically, we did it sort of single person. So they understand the organization. In order for you to have skin in the game, you're paying for the first X number. Once you have
Oh,
paid those, then we'll start covering.
so there's no way that this.
Nope, we're gonna assume that based on what I've given.
Like 0 is 5,000.
I don't. No, and I purposely given math that makes numbers push you in directions. Because not every idea for something you're going to invest in is always a good idea. Right?
Okay.
And you probably work somewhere where someone said, you know what, everybody needs this today. And everyone's like, this is a bad idea. But if you can't break it down to some sort of number, then that person who's charismatic and convinces everybody's a good idea wins. But that may not be best for the organization. Right? So this kind of tries to take away that whole idea of, hey, y'all like it, right? Make the dollars sense, right?
Just make sure you're on the giving end of that.
So, but as a boss, too, if you've got employees that have ideas, if you say, okay, convince me, right? Then if you come with a proposal that convinces them with dollars, then it can talk about. Without it, it's more like, I think it's a good idea, I champion it. Well, yeah.
They don't understand.
Exactly.
Last one.
She's gonna fix it.
Does she work there? Or she- You said
No.
Is it not?
It kind of takes a lot.
He's got to save your phone.
So this. And then everything else.
Oh, shit. No.
Yeah, and that way, if the resolutions get released in a while, it's like, okay, we know how to do it.
15,000.
I'm going to area 2, very deep.
That's a lot. Is it actually?
Yeah. Training can be expensive.
So,
But again, these numbers are made up for the sake of this. But yeah, training outside to,
oh, this is for.
Yeah.
Sure.
Or maybe I sold you a product that is digital and you can have everybody watch it and training side.
Price.
Yeah.
The representation, 5,000 for the price.
Realize.
That's
That's his promise. That's not like. We can afford all of it.
Yeah, they all, it's like we, this cost.
Oh, right. So safeguard value. So
Because
this
this
is
is-
$5,000. This is $4,000.
Because no matter what, if it was like all of the money, then you might be, our $10,000 would be gone.
Only have 10,000.
I did that one to make it hard, you like that? All right.
You want to spend all your money though, because you don't want the board.
Right.
It's money, you don't spend it all. So when we spent $4,000. Yeah.
So,
All right, let's go ahead and bring it in. Whether you're quite completely done or not. I think we've done enough to at least have this conversation. All right, so for that first scenario, what is our starting ALE? $10,000? Everyone agree? Okay. What is the ARO if we add the control in place? 5. Okay. What is the ALE with that control? 5,000. Everyone agree? Okay. What is our savings with the control? 5,000. Okay. What is the safeguard value?
5,000.
We pay 5,000. And so that means our realized savings is nothing. Right? So we can spend $5,000 to save $5,000. Maybe we'll decide to do that, right? There might be a world where that is a good decision, but at least we know that's kind of the trade-off, right? How much confidence do we have in those numbers? You know, might drive into some of that. All right, the second one. What is our ALE on the second one? Scenario 2. Website being hacked. Anyone capture that? What's that? 10,000 on this one as well? Okay, what is the ARO with the control? It'll be changed to once, right? Or cut down to the
Would be once every 2 years.
cut in half, so it'd be 0.5. Okay, so then what's the ALE with the control? 5,000. And our savings with the control? What's that? 5,000 system cost. 4,000. Okay, so 5,000 is what we saved, and we potentially pay how much for that? 4,000 with our realized savings being $1,000. Okay. Okay, that one's better than scenario 1, right? That comes out slightly better. All right, scenario 3. What's our ALE for this one? 24,000. What's our ARO with the control? Okay. What is our ALE with the control? 4,000. What is our savings with the control? Is it 20,000? And the safeguard value is 15,000, meaning my realized savings is 5,000. Okay. And the last one, ALE is 25,000. ARO with control. And our ALE with the control. $10,000. And our savings then is 15,000. And our safeguard value is how much? 13,000. Meaning our realized savings is 2,000. All right, everyone have something like that? Math agreeable? All right, I tell my business students, I say, this is the most complicated math we're gonna do all semester long. All right, so some of them groan when they hear math, but most of them do all of this. All right, anyway, so we have an idea of these different scenarios and what they cost. So if I came to you and said, you have $10,000 to spend, what decision do we make? What do I invest in?
Yeah, yes, really.
Which scenario?
That is scenario 2.
Scenario 2, I could invest in that one and I would save $1,000 by spending 5,000 of those $10,000. Everyone see why would I not invest in scenario 3 or scenario 4 here? They give me more money.
You don't have money.
I don't have the money to spend there. But why wouldn't I invest in scenario 1? But I still have $5,000. I wouldn't say it's burning the budget. Here's the thing, right? I have the budget. I'm not losing money by investing in it. And they're actually, if my estimates are wrong, I may actually be better off. There's also something that can be hard to quantify, which is what's the loss of goodwill and some of these sorts of things if you're compromised. So obviously scenario 2 is a good investment, but you can make an argument that because I have the money, even though I would be investing in not having a security incident, there'd be no real dollar sign savings. The headache and the frustration and some of those sorts of things that maybe aren't quantifiable are worth that investment as well. I wouldn't say I'm going to spend it because if not, then the organization's going to spend it somewhere else, right? At the end of the day, let's assume we're like, I don't know, Tesla, right? And they spent that money and they invested in more product and development stuff that makes stock prices go up. That's better for the organization overall. So that money could be used by the organization in ways that are good if we really don't need it. So you have to kind of at least hope that everybody's on the same page as far as the betterment of that. All right. But what if I said instead of $10,000, we have $15,000? What do we do? What do we invest in with $15,000? You say scenario what?
3.
Scenario 3. It costs $15,000 and I come out $5,000 ahead, right? Spends my entire budget right there, and that becomes the better decision. All right. What if the budget I'm given is $25,000? All right, big spenders now, right? $25,000.
Areas 2 and 3.
You would say 2 and 3. So we're going to spend $5,000 and $15,000. We're going to spend that $20,000 and get the $6,000 in savings, which is better than spending $13,000 to only get the 2, right? Which is what had happened down here. So we'll do scenario 3. I would say I'd throw in scenario 1 as well for the same reasons we said before.
Aren't we basically saying like what knapsack problem right now?
What do you mean by the knapsack
Or
problem?
I don't know if it's the knapsack problem. It's just like you're trying to you've got like a bag of a certain size and you're trying to put in various objects of various sizes and various values in that. You're trying to see what's the maximum amount of value to put in that.
Absolutely. Yep. Absolutely. That's what we're doing here. And we've made this exercise rather simple because I think the takeaway is pretty straightforward, right? We can get numbers based on some good estimates to say, here is where we can invest money. I would say the amount of budgets I've given you in this example are very small. I do that on purpose because I found for undergraduates, especially when I teach my undergraduate classes, they can wrap their brain around $25,000 a whole lot easier than they can $25 million. Right? At some level, they say, I'm not spending $2 million on that. That's a lot of money. So I keep the numbers small just because I think it's until you're used to making decisions around the millions of dollars, which is where they will probably be in most large organizations. It's kind of hard to conceptualize that in an undergraduate, probably even a graduate's experience with decisions they've had to make. So that's an assumption that's been made. Also, the examples have the numbers provided for you. You don't have to go out into the world and say, what would that number be? How do I come up with that? One of the things I've done as group projects for students is they will actually pick a problem in the world themselves, and then they're going to go out and justify an investment and how it's going to save organizations money. So they can take this learning activity and go out and actually apply these sorts of things. But that's what would happen in an organization, right? You'd say, we need to, this firewall is great, right? We want to buy this new firewall for our organization. And okay, justify why we need to spend X hundreds of thousands of dollars on all these new firewalls to save our organization money, right? And so you'd have to go and do that research to discover these numbers for yourself. All right, questions about that exercise and what we learned from that. All right, if we turn back to the risk assessment, I'm not going to go over this much other than it's available for you to look at. What we did right there is what's known as a quantitative risk assessment. On this worksheet, there's another process you can go through called a qualitative risk assessment, which is when you don't really have those dollar sign numbers, right? We have a probability number and an impact, and together we can multiply those together and say, what is the risk level of these different things? Sabotage by an internal employee. Bernie questioned how that could be 75% that you would have an internal employee sabotage. Well, in some ways, yes, it questions who are you hiring, which is an important thing to think about. But you trust your internal employees to have access to all sorts of things. And internal people getting mad and doing something is not an uncommon occurrence inside of an organization. When people get mad, they do things. And it can be bad for the organization. So at some level, yes, we trust people, but with these examples, the risk level of that one probably is the highest. And with this qualitative assessment, so you have to be able to justify, high, medium, low sorts of numbers that you put in there and use that to demonstrate we should invest in fixing this thing as opposed to addressing this other issue. It's a lot less compelling than the quantitative risk assessment, but there is a process you can go through to come up with those sorts of estimates. Questions about any of that?
Question, it's a good thing you only give us for problems. The knapsack problems that be hard.
Yeah, right. I mean, you can think about it. I mean, assuming we're talking about an entire organization and all sorts of security strategies, you could imagine that there are people that would spend weeks with Excel spreadsheets, putting all sorts of numbers together to look at all sorts of different things that they could consider doing, right? It's usually not cleanly defined to 3 or 4 scenarios. This actually, what I gave you guys is one part of an exam question that I give to my students. And some of them don't finish that activity because math. Other people are all like, I'm done in 5 minutes because I love math, right? And it's just, you know, how quickly can you do those things? But I purposely only give 4 scenarios because I need to be able to complete that problem in about a half hour. Yes, but yes, we can get much more complicated with all of that in the wild. So as we deal with the risk, what we did here was we did an assessment, right? We did an assessment and said, what's the risk that's going on? How do we mitigate it, right? These are some ways that we can mitigate problems. We need to justify, should we spend the money? Should we do these things? Let's see what sorts of things we can do. Let's put them in place. Once they're in place, then we're going to pay attention again, right? So this isn't a one-time decision. The world of technology is always changing. So we're going to go through this cycle and evaluate whether or not we have new risks. What's the math now with these new risks? What are some other things that we could be doing? So we're paying attention to all this and keeping track of new issues that are cropping up, or did the thing we put in place actually work the way we thought it should? And should we make other changes? So a continued process that we're paying attention to. Inside of an organization, you're going to have people whose job it is basically to pay attention to all of these things and keep track of it. As part of this process, organizations are going to have a few different documents, a few different things in place that helps them to make sure the business keeps operating the way that it should. One thing they're going to do is a business impact analysis. And they're going to go in and ultimately look at if something happens unexpected, what does that impact on our business? If our AWS servers go down for a day, what impact does that have on our ability to meet our clients' needs? Right? What's the financial impact? How do we deal with phone calls we're getting with everyone complaining? How does that affect our contract? All sorts of things. If these identifiable impacts happen, what does that do to our business? How do we address that? What are those things? And once we know that, then we can put together what's called a business continuity plan, which is when one of these things happens, how do we keep things going? And we're going to plan these out ahead of time. Why? Why are we going to put these plans out ahead of time?
Because, crisis does occur and then you're scrambling and you're unorganized and, it just doesn't work.
Exactly. In the moment of panic, you are going to make poor decisions, right? How many of you have ever, maybe, been in a car accident or known someone in a car accident? Or when that happens, what happens? Do you immediately know what your best next course of action is?
Yes.
Why?
Because it was in high school, so we pulled over and we're gonna call our parents, and then we're gonna get information from the other people, and then we're gonna just sit here until the police come.
Okay, but why? Why did you do that?
Because I've been told that that's what you're supposed to do.
Ahead of time, there was some planning that occurred. It said when an accident happens, you pull over, right? Maybe it's part of your driver's ed class, or maybe your dad said, all right, here's how things are, right? And you would put those things into place. If no one had told you that, you might, freak out and drive off. That'd be a bad decision in a car accident, right? They call that maybe a hit and run, right? Police get excited about those things. If we don't have a plan, we're going to respond in ways that may not work well. Same thing if, the entire power went out in this building right now. What would you guys do if all of a sudden power went out in this building? what do you guys do as students here?
15 minutes and go.
Wait 15 minutes and go home. Sweet, right? You guys leave, right? It doesn't matter a whole lot. The OT people, right? The people who've been helping us with things, their lives, their days just got really exciting. Right? With business continuity plan in place, they would have a checklist of things that say, okay, check this, check that, check this, figure out what's going on. Here's the people to contact. Here's the phone numbers. Everything would be spelled out so they can follow a checklist and know what to do. I have been places where things hit the fan and people are like, who's in charge? I don't have to do anything. Do you have to do anything? Nobody knew, right? And chaos ensues. When you have plans, ultimately you can follow. As part of those business continuity plans, well, let's talk about this first because they're related. A disaster recovery plan. A disaster recovery plan is different than a business continuity plan in that these are to deal with small, everyday, day-to-day sorts of issues that could arise. Whereas a disaster recovery plan is what happens if Mount St. Helens blows up. Right? It happened, what, about 40 years ago, before many of you in this room were born. But that's one of the major disasters we could have here. I guess in Seattle, if they get snow, it's kind of a disaster, but it really doesn't shut down things to the point where I live in Mississippi. There are these things called tornadoes that happen in Mississippi, right? And they could hit any town. They could take out all the power for an entire city that fast. I was teaching about disaster recovery planning when Houston, Texas got, what was like 53 inches of rain in 3 days, right? Where the hurricane just sat on top of Houston and dumped. And there's a whole lot of oil and gas companies that are headquartered in Houston. A whole lot of issues that happen when you get that amount of rain in place and all this flooding occurs, right? How do you make sure that when the main place where we do business can no longer operate, that our business can recover from that disaster and still have things to do, right? A little bit more involved than we lost power for an afternoon. What do we do about that, right? But we get a plan. We get the checklist. We know what we're going to do when those things happen. We know who's responsible for what. We know where the temporary headquarters is going to be. We know all these sorts of things, but how do we know it's going to work? Practice, right? So at least once a year, hopefully you are going through and practicing your business continuity plan, your disaster recovery plan, either with a real live scenario where you actually do it, which sometimes isn't possible. You may do a tabletop exercise where you say, let's step through the process and pretend like we're doing these things, or some balance between those. And what you're paying attention to is, are there things we didn't think of, right? Was there something in there that we didn't know what to do because nobody had written it down, right? What you're going to do then is you're going to update your documentation and you're going to fix it, make it better. The other thing it does is, let's assume that part of your disaster recovery plan is restoring your database from a backup. Well, the DBA should know how to do that, right? Database administrators should know how to restore a database from a backup. But if they haven't done it in 2 years, do they know the way that Oracle implementation does it? And are they familiar with actually doing that thing? So you get that practice of doing something that when you're under the pressure of get that working now because it's costing us money, they aren't doing it for the first time. Right? So we're going to go through, we're going to practice, we're going to make sure that these plans come together, that we know ultimately what we're doing. As part of these plans, we're going to come up with some goals. The recovery point objective is the whole idea of, this is the point of where our data needs to be rolled back to. We want to get to this point of recovery, and how fast do we want to get there? And so we're going to define that for different things. What level of data recovery do we need, and how fast are we going to get there? Depending on what your organization is, these numbers are going to differ. But having it defined lets you know, A, were we successful in meeting them? But it also gives you an idea of, how am I going to prioritize different activities? If I have one thing that I'm okay with 5 days being how long that service isn't available, versus something that we only want 1 hour, right? When we're trying to prioritize what do we do, these numbers help tell us what is the most important. When you're in the fire of a crisis, it's hard to do these kind of estimates and to come up with what is priority. So having them defined early helps. What are my requirements for getting the business recovered, as well as the technology? Defining those helps us know where are we going to put resources when things happen. As part of the plan, I put in disaster recovery plan, we're going to do a threat analysis, kind of talk about some of the similar things we did at the beginning of this exercise. We'll come up with some scenarios. What are some likely things that could happen, and what impact are those going to have on us, so we're prepared for them? We'll put documentation together, and not only do we have documentation together, but it is available in places that can be found and accessed in the midst of a disaster. If I say we are only going to store our recovery documents on the cloud, is that a good idea? No. Why? Why not a good idea? When it could be inaccessible. Depending on the impact, you may not be able to access your documentation because it was on the cloud. So you're going to have this binder that's really thick that someone printed, and probably nobody ever looks at because everybody goes to the cloud to look at the document. It's searchable, it's easy to find, yada, yada. But having that printed is important because disaster may actually make internet inaccessible. And ultimately identifying how are we going to recover from those disasters. Part of this process is going to decide, do we want a hot site, warm site, cold site, or mobile site for if something happens? So a hot site. This is an environment where everything is mirrored, everything is available, and it's up in real time. It's expensive. But if what you're doing is crucially important, necessary to have that investment, so you can just, at the flip of a switch, be back up in a matter of minutes, if not hours. A warm site has the environment, the hardware. It takes a little bit longer to fire it up and to get those things running. Usually have to back up in a day or so, maybe a little bit longer. A cold site has the basic environmental stuff, like the computers and those sorts of things. Takes a little bit longer to get those sites back up and working. And mobile sites would be a trailer that can be moved somewhere and set up. Something, and I think this is something a little bit dated from the material, obviously. One of the things that I think we have now with the nature of cloud computing that we're in is a lot of times we have mirrored access to everything that organizations do. Assuming AWS and those sorts of things stay up, it doesn't matter if I am in Houston, Texas, or Pullman, Washington. I probably can gain access to a lot of the storage, a lot of the processing maybe being done in the cloud, and those sorts of things, which is making it a little bit easier as long as I have offices across a wide geographic region to ensure that I can stay up and running should one particular location go down, assuming I have the personnel in place in those locations to do those things, to make those decisions. All right, questions about that? Awesome. So touched on risk, some of the things we're doing with risk. How do we convince people of risk? We're going to take another quick little bio break, 5 or 10 minutes this time. I think we're good at 5. You use the bathroom, go ahead and do that real quick. And Julia will lead us through the last section. So 10:35, we'll get started.